Success, power, prestige. Richard Wells had it all. At just 39, he was one of the most influential CEOs in the country, leading a multi-billion-dollar investment firm that had redefined the financial industry. His days were filled with high-stakes negotiations, luxury business trips, and exclusive events attended by the world's elite. Everything about him exuded control, from the tailored suits he wore to the meticulous way he structured his life. But beyond the towering glass windows of his penthouse office and the empire he had built from the ground up, something was missing. Richard just didn't know it yet. He had always believed that life was a numbers game. Assets, acquisitions, revenue growth. Those were things he understood. Relationships, family, emotions, those were unpredictable variables he never allowed himself to dwell on. They were distractions, and Richard Wells did not tolerate distractions. He had spent years carefully curating his world, making sure nothing unexpected disrupted his rise to the top, until one evening. One ordinary night in an upscale restaurant would change everything. It started like any other business dinner. A high-profile deal was on the table, and Richard was there to secure it. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in the city, a place where only the wealthiest and most powerful dined. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet sophistication. Soft jazz playing in the background, wine glasses clinking, murmured conversations about million-dollar investments. Richard was in his element. And then, just as he was about to seal the deal, something, or rather, someone, interrupted him. A small voice, a hesitant presence. Richard Wells. He barely glanced up at first, assuming it was a server or perhaps someone mistaking him for another businessman. But then he saw her, a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing near his table. Her blonde hair was slightly messy, her oversized hoodie and worn-out sneakers, standing in stark contrast to the restaurant's opulent setting. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her hands. Her bright blue eyes locked onto his face with a mixture of determination and nervousness. There was something eerily familiar about those eyes. Richard frowned, setting down his wine glass. "Excuse me?" She hesitated for just a moment before speaking again. "My name is Emily," she said softly. "I think you're my dad." Silence. The world around them faded. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of wealthy patrons, the carefully rehearsed business negotiations. All of it disappeared as Richard stared at the girl in front of him. His mind refused to process her words. Dad? No, that was impossible. It had to be a mistake. But as he looked at her again, really looked at her, something in his chest tightened. This wasn't a mistake. This was the moment his carefully controlled world would begin to unravel. For a man like Richard Wells, surprises were an unwelcome nuisance. His entire life had been built on precision, strategy, and control. He prided himself on eliminating the unknown from his world, whether in business or in life. And yet, here he was, sitting in the middle of an elite restaurant, frozen in place as an unfamiliar young girl claimed to be his daughter. It had to be a mistake. His business partner, seated across from him, cleared his throat awkwardly. The other guests at nearby tables had started glancing over, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected interruption. Richard's fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room. He hated attention when it wasn't on his own terms. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, kid, I don't know what kind of prank this is, but you have the wrong person." Emily didn't flinch. If anything, she looked more determined. "I'm not lying," she said firmly. "My mom," her name was Anna Carter. Richard felt his entire body tense at that name. Anna Carter. A name he hadn't heard in almost a decade. A name he had deliberately buried in the past. His grip on the glass loosened. His business partner looked between them, clearly uncomfortable. Richard inhaled sharply, forcing himself to keep his composure. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "But I have no connection to you, and I suggest you leave before you cause a scene." For the first time, Emily's expression faltered. Her lips pressed together, her small hands tightening around the folded piece of paper she held. Then, without a word, she slowly unfolded it and placed it on the table in front of him. Richard hesitated, but something inside him, something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to dread, forced him to look. It was an old photograph. A younger version of himself stood in the frame, his arm loosely draped around a woman he hadn't seen in years, Anna. She was smiling, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes filled with something warm and unspoken. And there, nestled between them, was a baby. Richard's breath caught. His baby. No, no, it couldn't be. He looked up sharply, his pulse thundering in his ears. Where did you get this? Emily swallowed, her fingers trembling slightly as she pointed to the back of the photograph. Richard flipped it over, scrawled in faded ink were the words. Richard, meet your daughter. Her name is Emily. The date on the photograph was from nearly 9 years ago. Richard's world tilted. This wasn't a lie. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. Emily was his daughter. He barely registered the sound of his business partner excusing himself and leaving the table. The restaurant around him felt distant, muffled, as if he were submerged underwater. His mind raced, desperately trying to piece together a fragment of a past he had long since abandoned. Anna, their brief but intense relationship, the way she had disappeared without a word, and now, standing before him, was the proof of what he had unknowingly left behind. Emily's voice broke through the haze. My mom passed away last year, she said quietly. She never told me about you, not until the very end. Richard's eyes snapped to hers. Passed away? His chest tightened, a foreign feeling of guilt creeping in. He hadn't thought about Anna in years. He hadn't even known she was gone. Emily took a deep breath. I didn't come here for money, she said. I didn't come here to ruin your life. She hesitated, and for the first time, Richard saw something vulnerable in her gaze. I just wanted to know if I mattered to you. A lump formed in his throat. For the first time in years, Richard Wells, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who could turn numbers into fortunes, had no words. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid of the answer. Richard Wells had always believed that the past was just that, the past. Something to be left behind. Something to be forgotten, if necessary. His philosophy had served him well in business. He had made tough decisions, walked away from failing ventures, and severed ties with people who no longer serve his ambitions. But as he sat across from the young girl who had just turned his world upside down, he realized something chilling. The past doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits. And when it finally comes knocking, it demands to be reckoned with. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably long. Emily sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her face an unreadable mass of emotions. She had just dropped a bombshell on the most powerful man in the room, and yet she remained steady, waiting for him to speak. But Richard, the Richard Wells, CEO, billionaire, and master of negotiations, had no idea what to say. He picked up the photograph again, staring at Anna's face. His mind reeled back to a time long before private jets, luxury cars, and boardroom deals. He had met Anna Carter when he was just an ambitious, struggling entrepreneur, trying to turn his first startup into something meaningful. She had been different from anyone he had ever known, grounded, warm, and uninterested in wealth or status. For a time, she had been his world. But that world had shattered when things between them fell apart. They had fought, over his work, over his long absences, over his obsession with success. And one day, she was simply gone. He had searched for her at first, but then life moved on. New deals, new cities, new people. He convinced himself that whatever they had wasn't meant to last. And now, all these years later, he was being forced to confront the consequences of what he had unknowingly left behind. He exhaled sharply, looking up at Emily. Why now? His voice was quieter than he intended. Why wait all these years to find me? Emily hesitated, then pulled something from her small bag. It was an old, slightly crumpled envelope. She slid it across the table. My mom wrote this before she passed, she said. She left it for me to read when I turned 8. It's the only thing I have that explains why she never told me about you. Richard stared at the envelope. His name was written across it in familiar, looping handwriting. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked it up. He swallowed hard before carefully opening it and unfolding the letter inside. Richard, if you're reading this, then Emily has found you, and I hope, despite everything, that you will listen. I never told you about her because I was afraid. Afraid that you wouldn't want her. Afraid that she would grow up feeling unwanted. I convinced myself that it was better this way, that I was protecting her from disappointment. But the truth is, I was also protecting myself. I was afraid of seeing you move on. I was afraid that if I reached out, I'd hear the words I dreaded the most, that you didn't care. But Emily deserves the truth. She's strong, just like you. She's smart, too, smarter than either of us. And she's got this big heart that reminds me why I fell for you all those years ago. I don't know if you'll accept her. I don't know if you will want to be part of her life. But please, Richard, don't push her away without knowing her. She's your daughter, and whether you choose to or not, she's always known you were a part of her. Anna, Richard's grip on the letter tightened. He could feel Emily watching him, waiting for his reaction, but his emotions were a tangled mess. Guilt, regret, pain. A deep, unfamiliar ache clawed at his chest. He had spent years building a life where he controlled every detail, and yet here was proof that he had been blind to something that truly mattered. When he finally looked up, Emily's expression was unreadable. "I don't expect anything from you," she said softly. "I just needed to know who you are." Richard exhaled slowly. Who he was, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure of the answer. Richard had built his entire life on control. In the world of business, he dictated the terms. He chose the deals, the partnerships, the mergers. He decided who stayed in his life and who was cut out. He was the one who called the shots. But now he sat in this elite restaurant, staring at a daughter he never knew existed, holding a letter from a woman he once loved, and he realized he had no control over this. And that terrified him. Richard placed the letter down carefully on the table, smoothing it out as if trying to press his emotions back into order. His mind was at war with itself. One side screamed at him to accept this, to acknowledge the girl in front of him, to make up for lost time. The other side told him to walk away, to push it down, to forget. And unfortunately, that side had always been stronger. His jaw tightened, his face a perfect mask of composure as he finally looked up at Emily. His tone was measured, almost businesslike. "What do you want from me?" Emily flinched slightly, as if she hadn't expected the coldness in his voice. But she recovered quickly, squaring her shoulders. "I don't want anything," she said firmly. "I'm not here for money or whatever you're thinking. I just wanted to know who you are. I just wanted to see for myself." Richard nodded slowly, as if considering her words. But deep down, a storm was raging. "She doesn't belong in your life. You don't have time for this. You never asked for this." His voice came out sharper than he intended. "Well, now you've seen me." Emily's expression shifted. Hurt flickered in her eyes, but she didn't let it settle. Instead, she clenched her fists on her lap, her posture stiffening. "That's it?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "That's all you have to say?" Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want me to say. Emily, I didn't know you existed. Your mother never told me. And now, after 18 years, you just show up and expect what exactly? A hug? A father-daughter moment?" Emily's eyes darkened. "I don't expect anything. But I thought just maybe you want to know me." Richard opened his mouth, but hesitated. He didn't have an answer, because the truth was, he did want to know her, but that terrified him. Letting someone in meant risk, and he had spent his entire life making sure no one got close enough to hurt him. He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Emily, you don't know me, and I don't know you. That's just reality." Emily's jaw tightened. "Whose fault is that?" Richard stiffened. The words hit harder than he expected, and then she pushed back her chair and stood up. "Forget it," she said. "I shouldn't have come here." Richard watched as she grabbed her bag, turning toward the door. This was it. This was the moment where he could either let her walk away, like he had let so many others walk away before, or He could do something different for once. For a brief second, his hand twitched as if he might reach for her. But years of emotional walls didn't crumble so easily. So he sat there, silent, as she walked out of the restaurant. And when the door finally closed behind her, the weight of his decision settled heavily on his chest. For the first time in his life, Richard Wells, the man who never lost anything, felt like he had just lost something irreplaceable. Richard had always been a man of logic. Everything in his life followed a structure, a carefully crafted order that he never deviated from. His empire was built on calculated risks, meticulous planning, and absolute control. But that night, as he sat alone in his office, staring blankly at the city skyline, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he couldn't focus. His mind refused to settle on quarterly reports, stock market projections, or the million other things that usually occupied his thoughts. Instead, all he could see was her, Emily, her defiant stance, the way her voice had wavered just slightly when she said, "I thought maybe, just maybe you'd want to know me." The memory cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He needed to push this aside. There was no point in dwelling on something he couldn't change. But as he turned toward his desk, his eyes landed on the crumpled letter, the letter from Sophia. His fingers hovered over for a moment before he finally picked it up, smoothing out the creases. He hesitated, then read it again. This time, he didn't skim through it. This time, he let every word sink in. "Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. For years, I've debated whether to reach out, whether it would be fair to you or to Emily. But the truth is, you deserve to know. And she deserved the choice to find you. I didn't keep her from you out of spite. I didn't tell you because I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't want her. Scared that she'd grow up knowing her father never wanted her. But she's stronger than I ever was. She wanted to find you. She wanted to know the truth. And no matter what happens now, I just hope you'll see what an incredible person she is. She doesn't need your money, Richard. She doesn't need anything from you. But maybe, just maybe, you need her. Sophia." Richard clenched his jaw, setting the letter down. His chest ached in a way he wasn't used to. He had spent his life avoiding attachment, convincing himself that emotions were a liability. But now he realized he wasn't protecting himself from loss. He was robbing himself of something real. And for the first time, he admitted it to himself. He had made a mistake. The next morning, Richard found himself standing outside a modest apartment complex on the other side of town. It was a far cry from the high-rise penthouses and luxury estates he was used to. His driver had offered to escort him, but Richard refused. This was something he had to do on his own. His fingers hovered over the buzzer for apartment 3B. Was he really doing this? Would she even want to see him? Before he could overthink it, he pressed a button. A few moments later, the door cracked open, revealing Emily in sweatpants and a loose hoodie. Her hair was slightly messy, as if she had just woken up. When she saw him, her expression flickered with surprise, then suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Richard exhaled, gripping the edges of his coat. He hesitated, then forced himself to look her in the eye. "I was wrong." Emily's brows furrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything. Richard cleared his throat. "You asked me if I wanted to know you, and I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how." Silence hung between them. Then Emily sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't get to just show up and say that after pushing me away." "I know." Richard nodded. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'd like one anyway." Emily crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "Why now?" Richard hesitated. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he admitted, "Because I've spent my whole life running from things that make me feel. And I don't want to run from this anymore." Emily searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. For the first time since she met him, she didn't find one. She let out a slow breath, then stepped back, leaving the door open. "Come in." For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like he was in control. And for the first time in his life, he didn't mind. Richard stepped into Emily's apartment, unsure of what to expect. The space was small but warm, filled with personal touches, framed photographs on the shelves, a cozy couch with mismatched cushions, and a faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. It was nothing like the cold, sterile perfection of his penthouse. It felt lived in. It felt like a home. Emily walked ahead of him, motioning for him to sit at the small dining table. She grabbed 2 mugs in the cabinet and poured coffee into both, setting one in front of him before taking a seat across the table. Richard stared at the cup. It had been years since someone had made him coffee without an assistant or barista involved. Something about it felt oddly intimate. "You drink black, right?" Emily asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced up, surprised. "How did you—" "I did my research," she shrugged, taking a sip of her own. Richard hesitated before lifting the cup to his lips. The coffee was slightly bitter, a little too strong, but he found he didn't mind. For a moment, they just sat there in silence. Neither of them knew how to start. Finally, Richard set his cup down and exhaled. "I don't know how to do this." Emily blinked, surprised by his honesty. "Do what?" He gestured vaguely. "This. Talking. Connecting. Being a father." Emily leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You don't have to be perfect at it, but you have to try." Richard nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here." She tapped her fingers against her mug. "So, what now?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "That's what I was going to ask you." Emily tilted her head. "What do you want from this?" Richard hesitated. He had spent his whole life making decisions based on logic and strategy. But this wasn't a business deal. This was something he had never learned how to navigate. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I don't expect anything. But I don't want to walk away again." Emily's expression softened slightly. "That's a start." Just as the tension in the room started to ease, a loud knock on the door made both of them jump. Emily frowned and got up to answer it. The moment she opened the door, a familiar voice barked, "What the hell is he doing here?" Richard turned just in time to see a young man storm into the apartment, mid-20s, broad-shouldered, eyes blazing with fury. "Liam," Emily started, but he ignored her. He was too busy glaring at Richard like he wanted to throw him out himself. "You don't get to show up after all these years and pretend you care," Liam snapped, stepping protectively between them. Richard straightened. "And you are—" "Her brother," Liam shot back. Richard blinked. "Brother?" Emily sighed. "Not by blood. Liam's my best friend. He helped my mom raise me." That explained the hostility. Liam crossed his arms. "So, what? You disappear for 2 decades and suddenly you want to play dad? You think one apology is enough?" Richard met his glare without flinching. "No, and I don't expect it to be." "Then what do you want?" "A chance," Richard said evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Liam let out a bitter laugh. "A chance? You don't deserve one." Richard sighed. He wasn't going to argue. Liam had every right to be angry. But Emily stepped in before the tension could escalate. "Liam, stop," she said firmly. "I get it. I do. But this is my decision." Liam turned to her, incredulous. "Are you seriously considering letting him in?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am." Liam scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." Emily sighed. "Look, I know you're angry, but this isn't your fight." Liam clenched his jaw, then turned back to Richard. "You hurt her, and I swear—" "I won't," Richard cut in, his voice steady. "Not again." Liam narrowed his eyes, but didn't say anything else. Instead, he shot Emily a look before muttering, "I'll be outside," and walking out the door. The room was silent again. Richard turned to Emily. "He cares about you." She smiled slightly. "Yeah, he does." Richard hesitated, then asked, "Would it be all right if we started slow?" Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think that would be best." Richard exhaled, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Relief. For the first time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything. The weeks that followed were filled with slow, tentative steps, some forward, some backward, but steps nonetheless. Richard and Emily agreed to meet once a week, sometimes for lunch, sometimes just for a walk. Their conversations were awkward at first, filled with long pauses and careful words. But as time passed, the silences became less heavy, the words less forced. Richard found himself learning about the daughter he never knew he had, her love for books, her dream of becoming a writer, the little quirks she had inherited from him without even realizing it. Emily, in turn, discovered parts of him that the world never saw. He wasn't just a ruthless CEO from magazine covers. He was a man burdened by regrets, trying, really trying, to make things right. But trust wasn't something built overnight. One evening, as they sat at a small cafe, Richard hesitated before asking, "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" Emily stirred her tea, considering his question. Forgiveness isn't something you earn in a day or a month. It's a process. Richard nodded, accepting her words. "And what about Liam?" She smirked. "Liam still thinks you're the villain in a corporate thriller, but he'll come around eventually." Richard let out a small chuckle. "I suppose that's fair." Emily glanced at him, her expression softening. "Look, I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that you're here now, and that means something." Richard exhaled slowly. "That's more than I could hope for." Silence settled between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, a new beginning. Months later, Richard found himself standing in a crowded bookstore, watching as Emily sat at a signing table, greeting fans with a bright smile. Her first book, a memoir part fiction, part truth, had just been published, and despite everything, despite the years lost between them, she had invited him to be there. He wasn't in the front row. He wasn't demanding attention. He was just present, and that, for the first time in his life, felt like enough. Emily caught his eye from across the room and gave him a small nod. Richard nodded back. They weren't a perfect family, but they were something. And sometimes that was all that mattered.